Some stories don't fade with time. They sit in the air like smoke after a fire, long after everyone's gone home. In Briar Ridge, North Carolina, folks thought they knew the ending to Kendra Vale's story. They thought justice had been served. 15 years in prison for killing her boyfriend, Mason Whitaker. No body, no goodbyes, just a blood-streaked pickup, a bruised history, and a courtroom where the verdict came quick. For the Whitakers, it was closure. For the town, it was proof they'd done right by one of their own. And for Kendra, it was a steel door that closed on everything she'd ever known. She always said Mason wasn't dead, said the truth would come out. But the truth doesn't always make it into the record. In 2016, that steel door swung open. A state crime lab scandal unraveled old cases, and hers was one of them. A private conversation between a judge and a prosecutor, buried for years, was suddenly on tape. Her conviction was vacated. She walked out free. But walking free isn't the same as being welcome. For 9 years, she kept her head down. Night shifts at a roadside motel. Small apartment. Routine drives to the lake. Her name stayed in the shadows. Until one July morning when fire lit the water. The Whitaker summer house was gone before sunrise. 3 inside never made it out. 1 was missing. And before the embers cooled, people were saying Kendra's name again. They said she'd finished what she started. But that's the easy version of this story, the one you can repeat over coffee and feel certain about. The real story is harder. It wins through old money and new debts, a missing man some swore they saw years after his funeral, and a family whose secrets may have been more dangerous than their enemies. Tonight, we go back to where it started. Back to the night Mason Whitaker vanished, and to the chain of choices that turned a quiet lakeshore into the center of a case the whole town thinks it understands, and maybe doesn't at all. Briar Ridge in 2001 was the kind of place where everyone knew not just your name, but the year your parents bought their house, who fixed your roof, and whether you kept up with your lawn. It was the sort of town where the Whitaker name was on the lumber mill, on the church donation plaques, and on the high school gym scoreboard. They had influence, and they knew how to use it. Mason Whitaker grew up in that shadow. Tall, easygoing in public, a little sharper in private, the kind of man who could hold court at the diner with a smile and a story. To the locals, he was a Whitaker through and through. Charming when it counted, and untouchable when it didn't. Kendra Vale was not untouchable. She was a waitress when they met, tending the late shift at a roadside grill. Folks said she had a stubborn streak, but they also said she had a good heart, one that kept forgiving Mason when maybe she shouldn't have. They had a history, the kind where neighbors sometimes heard shouting, where police were called but no arrests were made, where friends noticed the makeup didn't always match the season. In the summer of 2001, Mason was running the mills day to day, while Kendra was living with him in a small house just off County Road 9. On the evening of August 19th, Mason was seen leaving work after what one employee described as a heated exchange with his father. That was the last time anyone admitted to seeing him alive. The next morning, sheriff's deputies found Mason's pickup abandoned on a dirt track 2 miles from the Whitaker property. The bed was streaked with blood that would later be presented as his. The driver's side mirror was cracked, and the front bumper carried a fresh dent. There were no signs of forced entry, no wallet, no phone, and no Mason. By that afternoon, word spread that Kendra had been picked up for questioning. In the official narrative, she was the last person known to be with him. Detectives said her account didn't match certain timelines, that she couldn't explain where she'd been between 9 p.m. and midnight. They noted past police visits to their home, each time logged as domestic disturbance. To the prosecution, those old call logs painted a clear picture. This was a violent relationship that had ended the way many do, in blood. Kendra told them Mason had left that night angry, and she hadn't seen him since. She asked if they'd checked the family's hunting cabin. She asked if they'd talked to the men Mason sometimes met after hours at the mill. She said if they were looking at her, they were looking the wrong way. The problem was, in Briar Ridge, the Whitaker word carried more weight than hers. The district attorney, a man known to spend weekends in the Whitaker box seats at Panthers games, brought the case to a grand jury in record time. There was no body, but there was blood in her truck, and there was a story that fit the town's sense of order. In the fall of 2002, the trial began. Jurors heard about the dented fender, the bloodstains, and a bruise on Kendra's arm the night she was questioned. They heard about arguments overheard by neighbors, and about the time Mason's mother claimed she'd seen Kendra throw a glass at him during a family cookout. They did not hear about the missing security footage from the mill or the anonymous tip the sheriff's office logged and never followed up on. The one that claimed Mason had been spotted at a truck stop 50 miles away 2 days after he disappeared. Kendra's public defender objected when the prosecution leaned on character witnesses who spoke more about her temper than the night in question, but the judge allowed it. In a town where everyone's connected, the trial felt less like a search for truth and more like a confirmation of what most had already decided. After just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict for second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 15 years in the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women. No body was ever found. Mason Whitaker's name was added to the memorial plaque at Briar Ridge First Baptist, and the town put the matter to rest. For the Whitakers, it was over. For Kendra, it was just the start of a sentence she would serve for a crime she swore never happened. 14 years into her sentence, Kendra Vale had learned how to live without expecting anything to change. Her world was cement walls, state-issued uniforms, and a narrow window that caught the afternoon sun for 20 minutes a day. She worked laundry detail, read paperbacks from the prison library, and kept to herself. The women around her turned over every few years, but Kendra stayed, carrying the weight of a case no one outside those walls still talked about. Then, in the spring of 2016, the state crime lab landed on the front page. A technician named Carl Denton, someone whose signature sat on dozens of lab reports, was accused of falsifying test results. He'd cut corners, mixed up samples, and in some cases, written conclusions without running the tests at all. It wasn't just one case, or 10. It was hundreds. State auditors started pulling files, cross-checking evidence logs, and alerting defense attorneys. That's when a thick manila envelope landed on the desk of a public records lawyer who had handled innocence cases before. Inside was a list. Kendra's case number was on it. At first, she didn't believe it would matter. Too much time had passed. Too many people in Briar Ridge had a stake in keeping the old story intact. But her appellate attorney, a woman named Dana Morse, wasn't willing to leave it there. She filed a motion to have the original forensic evidence reviewed under independent conditions. What came back shifted the ground. The blood found in the bed of Mason's pickup, the central piece of physical evidence against her, had been declared a match to Mason by Denton in 2001. In reality, no conclusive testing had ever been completed. The chain of custody was incomplete, with gaps in the log where the sample had left the lab for periods that couldn't be accounted for. The state's case had hung on a report that should never have been admissible. As Dana dug deeper, another document surfaced. This one had nothing to do with the lab. It was a recording, old enough that the voices were a little tinny, like it had been captured on a handheld cassette. On it, Judge Robert Whitaker, the presiding judge in Kendra's trial and Mason's own uncle, was speaking privately to the prosecutor. He could be heard steering the conversation toward which pieces of evidence the jury will respond to and which ones should be kept in the background. The defense had never been told this meeting took place. Under state law, it should have been disclosed. Combined with the lab scandal, it was enough for the Court of Appeals to vacate her conviction. On August 8, 2016, Kendra Vale stepped out of the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women with a cardboard box of personal items, a set of civilian clothes that didn't quite fit anymore, and no plan for where to sleep that night. The district attorney announced there would be no retrial, citing the deterioration of evidence and challenges of locating witnesses after so many years. It sounded procedural, but in Briar Ridge it landed as an unspoken warning. The law might have let her go, but the court of public opinion had not. The Whitakers didn't speak to the press, but their absence said enough. People in town avoided her at the grocery store. Conversations stopped when she walked into the diner. In the official record, she was free. In the eyes of Briar Ridge, she was just loose. Kendra found a room above a closed barber shop, then a second-hand studio apartment near the interstate. She took the kind of job no one else wanted. Night clerk at a motel off I-40, swapping keys for cash with truckers and travelers passing through. She kept her hair short, wore plain clothes, and learned to move through town like a shadow. It wasn't the life she'd imagined, but it was life outside, and for a while, that was enough. Until the summer morning when flames lit the lake, and the past she'd been carrying alone became the only thing anyone wanted to talk about again. Freedom didn't come with a welcome sign. When Kendra left the prison yard, the world she stepped into was faster, louder, and colder than she remembered. The roads felt narrower, the people more guarded. She found a small apartment above a liquor store, a single room with a window that looked out over the alley and a door that stuck when the weather swelled. Her possessions fit into one duffel bag. Most days she kept to herself. She worked nights at a budget motel just off I-40, the kind of place where the carpet never looked clean, where keys went out to truck drivers who paid in cash, where stories were exchanged in fragments at the front desk and never repeated outside those walls. She liked the quiet between midnight and dawn, the hum of the soda machine, the faint smell of coffee left on the burner too long. It was the only time she could think without wondering who was watching her. She rarely went into Briar Ridge proper. Too many stairs, too many whispers that stopped the second she looked up. When she did, it was for groceries or to see her parole officer, a man who kept his questions to the checklist and his eyes on the clock. Once a week, on her nights off, she drove out toward the lake. She parked near the causeway, rolled down the windows, and let the sound of water lapping the shore fill the car. It was the same lake she and Mason had driven to years earlier, back when they were still trying to make things work. Sitting there now wasn't about nostalgia, it was about routine. The lake was still, predictable, something she could count on in a life that had been anything but. The years passed without big changes. She paid her rent, kept her head down, and learned which neighbors she could nod to without starting a conversation. To outsiders, it might have looked like nothing was happening. But in a small town, nothing can be its own kind of tension. It was early on a July morning when that tension finally broke. Before the sun came up, a call went out to the county fire department. Reports of an explosion on the east side of the lake. By the time the first engines arrived, flames were pouring through the roof of the Whitaker summer house. The fire moved fast, feeding on dry wood and open air. Inside, crews found Roland Whitaker, his wife Evelyn, and their son Colt. All three pronounced dead at the scene. One family member was unaccounted for, Harper Whitaker, the youngest daughter. Her SUV was gone. The next detail came from the county sheriff's office. Traffic cameras had picked up a light-colored Toyota Corolla crossing the causeway a few hours before the fire. The plate was unreadable, but to people in Briar Ridge, it didn't need to be. They'd seen Kendra in that car for years. Deputies later confirmed her phone had pinged on the same cell tower that carried the Whitaker devices in the hours before the blast. No one waited for an arrest to be made. In the diners, in the grocery store aisles, the verdict was already in. She'd come back to finish what she started. But that conclusion left out too much. It left out why Harper's SUV vanished without a trace. It left out the debts piling up against the Whitaker estate. It left out the people outside the family who had just as much to lose if certain truths saw daylight. And it left out the fact that the woman they swore was guilty had been sitting in her car at that same lake almost every week for 9 years without a single incident. What happened in those hours before the fire would become the fault line in a case that split Briar Ridge all over again. And the first person to see it for what it really was didn't even live in town. SGT. Lila Moreno had been in Briar Ridge less than a year when the lake house fire made headlines. She wasn't born there, didn't go to school with the Whitakers, and didn't have a seat at their Sunday table. She'd transferred from Forsyth County after 8 years in violent crimes, used to looking at cases without hometown loyalties clouding the file. When she read the initial reports on the fire, she noticed how fast the narrative hardened around one name: Kendra Vales. It was in every witness statement, not because anyone had seen her set the fire, but because it fit the story people already knew. Moreno had seen that before, cases that seemed airtight until you looked past the first layer. She pulled the full case file on the fire and went page by page. The preliminary cause was listed as arson, accelerant found in the structure, ignition point near the main support beam. But there was something missing. No direct evidence tying Kendra to that accelerant, no fingerprints, no eyewitness placing her on the property. Moreno requested the Whitaker family's financial records, starting with the trust that controlled their assets. What came back wasn't the picture of stability people imagined. The trust was in the red, property taxes overdue on 2 parcels, and Colt Whitaker's lumber mill had been leveraged heavily to a consultant whose LLC didn't match any state registration. That raised her next question: who was really in control of those debts? Then came Harper's side of the story, or at least the pieces Moreno could find. 3 weeks before the fire, Harper had signed a contract with a production company in Raleigh for a podcast series she called Inheritance Season. According to the notes in her pitch, the series would explore family legacy, hidden truths, and what gets buried to protect a name. The first episode was due to release the same week the lake house burned. Harper hadn't told her parents. She hadn't told her brother. But she had told someone outside the family, someone who later forwarded those emails to investigators after she vanished. Moreno's next lead came from even farther away. A retired dockhand in Ohio named Deshaun Price contacted the sheriff's tip line after seeing the fire coverage on the news. He sent in a photo taken at a marina in 2012. Standing behind the counter was a man who called himself Travis Lane. Stockier than in his youth, hair shaved close, heavier in the jaw, but the eyes looked like Mason Whitaker's. Price remembered him because he paid in cash, kept to himself, and left after a few months without notice. Moreno compared the photo to Mason's driver's license from 2001. The resemblance wasn't a coincidence you could dismiss with a shrug. If Mason had been alive 11 years after his supposed death, the foundation of Kendra's original conviction crumbled even further. And if Mason had staged his own disappearance with the help of his family, the fire wasn't about revenge at all. It was about control, and maybe about erasing the last person in the Whitaker circle who could tell the real story. Still, Moreno knew a theory wasn't enough. She needed a trail that could be followed, something to show whether Harper's disappearance and the fire were pieces of the same plan. That trail began to form when a set of traffic camera images came back from the state database. Harper's SUV heading west on the highway hours after the fire, alone in the frame, no convoy, no chase. To most in Briar Ridge, that detail was just a footnote. To Moreno, it was the start of a second investigation, one that might lead not to the woman everyone was ready to condemn, but to a truth the Whitakers had spent decades keeping out of the light. If the man in that Ohio marina photo really was Mason Whitaker, it meant the story Briar Ridge had lived with for nearly a quarter of a century was built on air. It also meant someone had helped him vanish and stay gone. Moreno began pulling every scrap of information from the years after 2001 that had any connection to the Whitaker family's finances, travel, or business dealings. One thread kept surfacing: insurance. In the months following Mason's disappearance, 3 separate life insurance policies paid out in full. The first was through the mill, the second through a private insurer, and the third a smaller policy his parents had taken out when he was in high school. Altogether, the payouts exceeded $1 per million. Records showed those funds flowed into the family trust and were used to pay off loans, invest in new equipment for the mill, and purchase the very lake house that now lay in ruins. Normally, those transactions would raise questions. But with a death certificate in hand, signed and filed, the banks had no reason to doubt the claim. The man who signed that death certificate was Judge Robert Whitaker, Mason's uncle, and the same man who presided over Kendra's trial. The conflict of interest wasn't hidden, it was simply accepted. If Mason had been alive all this time, the judge's role shifted from respected arbiter to someone who had sanctioned a disappearance and presided over the conviction of an innocent woman. Moreno also noted that after 2012, the year of the marina sighting, there was no trace of Travis Lane in public records. No rental agreements, no vehicle registrations, no utilities in his name. Whoever Mason became after that point, he knew how to disappear more thoroughly. Moreno considered the possibility that Harper's planned podcast wasn't just about the family's public history. It might have been about this secret. If Harper had stumbled onto proof that Mason was alive, it would explain the timing of her disappearance, the missing SUV, and the fire. Moreno tracked down the production company in Raleigh and spoke with the series producer. He confirmed that Harper had been working on interviews and had hinted that the final episode would change the way people saw the Whitakers forever. She hadn't shared specifics, but she'd been adamant about keeping certain recordings off cloud storage. That meant the files were likely kept on a physical device, something that could be taken, destroyed, or hidden. Moreno added this to her timeline. Mason disappears in 2001, declared dead. Insurance pays out. Kendra convicted. In 2012, a man matching his description is living under an alias in Ohio. By 2016, Kendra's conviction is vacated and she is released. In the summer of 2025, Harper is about to release a podcast exposing hidden truths. The Whitaker family is deep in financial trouble, and a fire wipes out 3 members while the 4th vanishes. Each of these points was a spark, but together they were a fuse. What Moreno couldn't yet prove was how Mason fit into the events of July 14th. If he was alive, was he in Briar Ridge that night? Did he have a hand in the fire, or was someone else removing loose ends on his behalf? And if he was gone again, was it by choice, or because someone who once protected him had decided he'd become a liability? In the sheriff's timeline, the camera still of a light-colored Corolla crossing the causeway was the moment Kendra Vale's name re-entered the official record. It was time-stamped at 2:14 a.m., a few short hours before the fire. The angle was poor, the plate unreadable, but to those who'd seen her car around town, the match seemed certain. Deputies paired that image with cell tower data from her phone, showing a connection to the same tower that handled the Whitaker devices during that window. On paper, it was enough to put her near the scene. For most people in Briar Ridge, that was the only proof they needed. But Moreno wasn't satisfied with paper. She pulled Kendra's parole records, including logs from her supervising officer. The notes were sparse but consistent. Occasional mention of her habit of driving to the lake late at night, parking near the water, sometimes staying for hours. It wasn't a secret. She'd told her PO outright, saying it was one of the only places she felt calm, a place she could sit without walls pressing in. In 9 years of those visits, there had never been a complaint, no reports of disturbance, no incidents tied to her presence. Moreno retraced the route from Kendra's apartment to the causeway, noting that the path took her right past the turnoff to the Whitaker property. A drive she'd made dozens of times would have looked the same on a traffic camera, whether she kept going to her usual spot or turned toward the house. The distinction was in what happened next, and there was no footage to show it. The tower ping was another point that seemed stronger than it was. In a rural county, coverage areas can stretch for miles. A phone in a parked car by the water would connect to the same tower as a phone inside the lake house. The technology can't tell the difference. Still, the timing placed her close, and proximity in a case like this can be enough to cast a long shadow. Moreno met with Kendra, not in an interrogation room, but in a small conference space at the motel where she worked. She asked directly about that night. Kendra didn't hesitate. She said she'd clocked out just after midnight, stopped at a gas station for coffee, then driven to the causeway. She remembered the fog on the water and the way the air felt heavy before a storm. She said she sat with the windows down, listening to the water, until nearly 3, then went home. She swore she never left the causeway. Moreno noted the detail about the fog, cross-checked it with the weather report, and found it matched. It didn't clear her, but it didn't fit the image of someone slipping onto the property, setting an accelerant, and making it back to the car unnoticed. There was no sign her vehicle had carried accelerant residue, no footprints matching her shoes recovered from the property, no trace evidence linking her physically to the house. The only thing connecting her to the fire was being in the wrong place at the wrong time, something she'd been accused of before, with devastating results. But in the court of public opinion, her history and that camera still had already fused into a verdict. Moreno knew if she didn't find a stronger lead, Kendra would carry that verdict whether charges were filed or not. The break came from a detail no one expected to matter: the location of Harper's missing SUV and what it held inside. The search for Harper Whitaker's SUV stretched across county lines, more out of obligation than expectation. Most assumed it was at the bottom of the lake or burned somewhere out of sight. 2 weeks after the fire, a deputy in Tennessee called it in. Parked behind an abandoned service station just off the interstate, dusted with pollen, driver's window cracked. The plates matched. Moreno drove up to see it herself. The exterior showed no damage, no signs of forced entry. The ignition was intact, no glass on the ground, which told her it hadn't been stolen by force. Inside, the air was stale and faintly sweet, the way it gets when a car has been closed up for days. The driver's seat was pushed farther back than Harper's height would have required, suggesting someone else had been behind the wheel. In the center console sat a hair tie, stretched and frayed, dark strands twisted into the elastic. Forensics pulled DNA, partial match to Harper, but mixed with an unknown profile. On the rear floor mat were fibers that didn't belong in that make or model, short, coarse, tan-colored strands. Moreno sent them to the lab, and the report came back clear. They matched the carpet in Colt Whitaker's office at the mill. Whoever had been in that SUV had been inside the office within days of the fire. That meant Harper had either been in close contact with someone at the mill after her family died, or she'd been in the company of the person who took her there. The placement of the SUV made less sense if Kendra were responsible. It was too far from Briar Ridge for her to risk driving without being seen, and there was no evidence her car or clothing carried any trace from the vehicle. Moreno looked again at the timeline. If Harper left the lake house before the fire, she had a window of several hours to reach the state line, switch drivers, and disappear. The question was why she hadn't surfaced since. The SUV hadn't been wiped completely. There were prints, partials on the rearview mirror, smudged on the inside of the driver's door. None matched Kendra. None matched Harper. They belonged to an unknown male. Moreno now had a sequence that didn't fit the revenge story. A fire that conveniently erased 3 potential sources of information. A 4th family member who vanished with her vehicle, and physical evidence showing she'd been in contact with someone tied to the mill after the fire. To Moreno, the SUV was less a getaway car than a breadcrumb, one that pointed to the possibility that Harper wasn't a victim at all, but a witness running from someone who had just removed the rest of her family. The only question was whether that person was acting to protect Mason Whitaker or themselves. By the time the SUV evidence was processed, 2 very different stories had taken hold in Briar Ridge. One was simple, direct, and easy to pass around over coffee at the diner. In that version, Kendra Vale spent 15 years in prison for killing Mason Whitaker, came out carrying the weight of that grudge, and waited for the moment to strike back. The fire, they said, was that moment, a final act meant to settle a score no court could fix. The camera still on the causeway, the cell tower ping, and the history between her and the family were enough to make that narrative sound complete. But there was another version, one that didn't spread as fast because it required looking closely at the pieces that didn't fit. In that telling, the fire wasn't about an old relationship. It was about silencing people. The Whitaker Trust was in trouble. Colt's Mill was carrying debt tied to someone who didn't exist on paper. Harper was days away from releasing a podcast that hinted at buried family secrets. And then there was Mason. Declared dead in 2001, but seen in Ohio in 2012, living under another name. In this version, Kendra's presence at the lake was nothing new. She'd been there countless nights without incident. The causeway photo was a familiar pattern, not a sign of guilt. The SUV's location across state lines, the unknown male prints inside, and the fibers from Colt's office pointed to someone else moving through this timeline. Someone who had access to both the mill and Harper in the days after the fire. Moreno began charting the 2 versions side by side, marking what was fact, what was alleged, and what remained unknown. On the Kendra side, the conviction in 2002, the causeway sighting, the history with Mason. On the other, the financial records, the podcast contract, the Ohio photograph, the SUV evidence. The column marked unknown grew the fastest. It held questions no one in town could answer. Where Harper was now, whether Mason was alive today, and who stood to gain the most from the fire. In Moreno's experience, the truth often lived in that column, not in the neat boxes people preferred. What she needed was something that could bridge the gap between the theories, a piece of evidence that would show whether this was the work of a woman seeking revenge or the fallout of a secret the Whitakers had been guarding for decades. That bridge, if it existed, would decide whether the case stayed open or closed for good. In the weeks after the fire, Briar Ridge felt smaller than ever. The charred remains of the lake house were fenced off, but people still slowed their cars to look, as if staring long enough might reveal what happened inside. The official investigation stayed tight-lipped. Kendra Vale was questioned, released, and never formally charged. She went back to her motel shifts, knowing that every set of headlights passing the front desk might belong to someone there to watch her, not check in. The State Bureau of Investigation kept the fire file open, citing ongoing forensic analysis. Lab reports were sealed under the active case exemption. Moreno worked with what she could: financial documents, interviews, and a handful of physical clues that hadn't been buried in ash. The Whitaker estate went into probate within a month, lawyers circling the family assets. Without Roland, Evelyn, or Colt, control of the trust fell into dispute. The debts tied to the mill remained unresolved. Moreno learned that the consultants LLC had been dissolved quietly just days after the fire, with no forwarding contact. Harper's name was still in the missing persons registry, but her photo was already fading from the flyers taped in gas station windows. No ransom notes, no verified sightings. Her phone remained powered off since the night of the fire. Kendra's life stayed under the weight of suspicion. The people who believed she was guilty never wavered. The ones who thought she was framed were fewer, quieter, and mostly kept their thoughts to themselves. For Moreno, the case refused to settle. There were too many moving parts for the fire to be a single act with a single purpose. She sent the unknown male prints from the SUV to the national database, knowing that without a match they'd remain just another unsolved link. The same went for the mixed DNA on the hair tie, partial profiles with no hits. She pushed to re-examine the 2001 disappearance in light of the Marina photograph, but without proof of Mason's current whereabouts, the request stalled. The SBI marked the Whitaker fire as an active arson homicide with a related missing persons case. That status could hold for months or for decades. In Briar Ridge, life moved forward, but the story hung in the air, reshaping itself depending on who told it. For some, it was about a woman who had escaped justice once and was finally being watched closely enough. For others, it was about a family whose power had kept the wrong person behind bars and whose secrets had finally caught up with them. And for a small handful who paid attention to details that didn't make the front page, it was about a thread that had been pulled loose in 2001 and was still unraveling. 24 years have passed since Mason Whitaker was last seen in Briar Ridge, and in that time the story has changed shape more than once. It began as a disappearance that turned into a conviction. It became a prison term that ended without an apology. And now it's a fire that has left more questions than answers. Kendra Vale walks free, but her name is still linked to every whisper about the lake house. The Whitaker family is gone except for one missing daughter whose absence may be the most telling detail of all. Somewhere out there is a man who might be Mason Whitaker, living under another name, holding the key to both the original case and the night the flames reached the roof of that house. The facts that can be proven are thin, but the pieces that suggest a different truth are harder to ignore. A trust in debt, a business tied to a name that doesn't exist, a podcast that may have been set to air what others had worked to keep buried. Moreno is still on the case, still following the leads that pull her away from the version the town repeats, and toward one that explains why the Whitaker story keeps circling back to the same points: money, power, and the control of what people believe. The unknown fingerprints in the SUV, the mixed DNA on the hair tie, the fibers from Colt's office, and the Ohio photograph are not just footnotes. They are unanswered calls for context. In the absence of a confession, every conclusion is a choice about which version of the story to accept. Was the fire the final act of a woman who had lost 15 years to a wrongful conviction, or was it the consequence of a secret that could not survive exposure? The official investigation is still open. The witnesses who could answer the most pressing questions are either missing, uncooperative, or presumed dead. And the people of Briar Ridge keep living with a case that is part fact, part memory, and part rumor. If you were in Kendra Vale's position, freed after years behind bars, still blamed for something you say you didn't do, watching the family that put you there lose everything, what would you have done? And if you had information that could settle once and for all whether Mason Whitaker has been alive this whole time, would you come forward? This is the Whitaker fire, the disappearance of Harper Whitaker, and the long shadow of a vanishing that began in 2001. It may never end in a courtroom, but it will not be forgotten. Where do you stand? Was this revenge, or the end of a lie too large to hold?